morning, Mike. Thanks for taking some time to share your questions for candidates today. And we got some news today about the state of foster care and care in general for Indigenous kids. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that and talk about what's going on and what it would look like to address those as we lead up to this election.
Sure. Thanks, Victoria. So we've been following our friend and colleague Cindy Blackstock in her leadership at the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society for a long time. Cindy's a major leader on issues of child welfare in Canada, specifically on reserve. And she's been working closely with the Assembly of First Nations since 2007 to address issues of equity in Indigenous child welfare. The fact is there's been serious underfunding for a very long time, and that's catastrophic in many cases. And the news today particularly underlines that. Underfunding leads to lost lives, and it's tragic. It's tragic, but it's not surprising, which is terrible. So anyhow, since 2007, there's been a case on equity and justice for Indigenous kids in child welfare put forward by Cindy Blackstock and the Assembly of First Nations. And earlier this month, that tribunal ruled that Canada was willful and reckless. That's a direct quote, willful and reckless in its failure to fund First Nations child welfare adequately. And then that tribunal ordered really significant compensation. Now, Cindy Blackstock reminds all Canadians very regularly that reconciliation means not saying sorry twice. What does that mean in this case of First Nations child welfare? Well, it means we're a very long way from reconciliation. So please, friends, ask your candidates what they'll do to ensure equity in Indigenous child welfare, specifically by implementing TRC calls to action 1 through 5, and then also by asking them what they'll, as a party and a government, do to comply with the orders of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on First Nations child welfare.
Mike, the Center for Public Dialogue has done some deep learning and research into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in terms of education. Can you talk a little bit more about why education is so important and what we'd like to see implemented and grown in that area?
Sure. So we've been following this set of issues since 2010. And the reason for that was when Canada first affirmed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in November of 2010. The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations at the time said one of the priorities for implementation was education, which makes an awful lot of sense. Education is sometimes called the new buffalo because of its significance in terms of opportunity and health and well-being. The point is, Indigenous people have identified education as a major element of moves forward for reconciliation and justice. So we've had the privilege of walking alongside Indigenous educators and policy experts since 2010 to learn about what justice and reconciliation in education mean. And the core things that we've learned are that success in Indigenous education includes a few very basic components. First of all, direct language and culture content in the education. It roots identity in a really healthy way. Secondly, the participation of elders and community in the delivery of education, which sounds really familiar to those of us who have roots in Christian education systems, because we know that community is a really significant part of learning and making it stick with students. So we've seen those markers of success, and for that reason, we've encouraged the implementation of them in policy. Another really core part of success in education is funding equity. And the problem is we've known now for quite a few years that there's a significant funding gap, much like the gaps in child welfare. To the extent that funding gap leads to serious discrepancies in graduation rates. So in the spring of 2018, the Auditor General revealed a shocking statistic. 24% of First Nations kids on reserve graduate from high school. By contrast, in provincial systems, that rate ranges from about 85 to about 90, 95%. So in that range, it's never 100, interestingly enough. So again, that gap is rooted in that long-term underfunding. And it's going to take a lot of persistence and commitment to overcome those challenges. We've seen a few good steps in the last several years in terms of some funding improvements and some efforts to build self-determining education systems in First Nations communities and First Nations regions. Those are really positive steps. The point is those steps need to continue and grow. So the thing we'd ask folks to be in conversation with their candidates about are just about that persistence. And again, the symbol of that persistence and dedication would be implementation of Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And in this case, it's calls to action 7 through 10, which really emphasize equity in education. So please ask your candidates what they'll do to fulfill TRC calls to action 7 through 10.
Thanks, Mike.